Welcome back to another episode of Thinking Critically. Today, I am joined by Dr. James Zimring, who is a professor of pathology at the University of Virginia, where he pursues basic and translational research in the field of transfusion medicine and blood biology. He has an MD and also a PhD in immunology, both awarded from Emory University, and he's published over 160 research articles. James is the recipient of multiple awards for his research and teaching and an elected member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation. For over a decade, he's taught courses to graduate students on the philosophical underpinnings of scientific approaches to basic biomedical research, a topic seldom taught in a formal setting to students of science, despite the essential role it plays in scientific research. While delivering lectures as a visiting speaker at different research universities, James frequently delivers lectures on the practice of science itself to students and faculty alike. Out of these activities, he has authored a book for lay audiences and scientists alike entitled What Science Is and How It Really Works. Most recently, and the primary focus of today's episode, is discussing his latest book, Partial Truths: How Fractions Distort Our Thinking. Anyway, James, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, it's completely my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. It sounds like we have both a strong interest in teaching the philosophical foundations to future scientists and why it's so important. But before we kind of move into the other questions, I want to really know kind of how you got your interest in science and where it came from and why medicine. All of these fun things. I always ask scientists who come on these questions.
Yeah, I think that you hear common stories from a lot of scientists that I was always interested in how things worked. And as a kid, my room was littered with the things I'd ripped apart that no longer worked, but I saw how they had worked previously. And when I got into college, I became interested in chemistry. I was very fortunate that, as many undergraduates are fortunate, that a professor there allowed me to start doing a research project in his lab, doing organic synthetic chemistry. And I caught the fever, right, like many of us do. And so having gotten my degree in chemistry, had always been interested in trying to mitigate human disease and suffering. And so the medical sciences were very attractive to me, but the MD PhD route in particular, because of the research training and the mechanistic dissections you can do. And if I had to, on balance, I'd probably say I'm more of a scientist who kind of fell into going to med school instead of the other way around, but you meet all paths. And then after I got my degrees and I did my training clinically in clinical pathology, which includes transfusion medicine and immunology. Transfusion medicine is basically human immunology applied. And so the two kind of merged together. And that's how I got into my scientific field of study.
So in particular, because I'm just really curious here, with the immunology component, what does your research really focus around with that?
Right. So most people have heard of ABO, blood group antigens, that, if you don't give the blood match to the right person, then it can cause all kinds of medical problems, including, death. But what most people don't know is that there are at least 340 antigenic differences that vary amongst humans on blood. So anytime you're transfusing blood, you're exposing the recipient to a lot of foreign stuff. And the immune system of the recipient can react to things. Now, once you have an immune reaction to someone else's blood, you can't receive blood from that person anymore. And if you only need one transfusion, maybe two, that's no big deal. But for people who need chronic transfusion, and there are a lot of people who need chronic transfusion, some of them make antibody after antibody after antibody, so much so that some people die for want of a transfusion because we can't find blood or enough blood that they can receive that they don't have antibodies against. So, and this is going on, with 1 out of every 70 Americans is transfused each year. So, and what the clinical laboratories do, the blood banking laboratories, is they monitor the immune reactions of pretty much everyone who's transfused. But understanding how and why and when the immune system responds to red blood cells, which, by the way, is different from a virus or a vaccine, is therefore really of great clinical importance. And that's how my immunology and my clinical work kind of merge.
Yeah, that sounds remarkably important. Like you said, I mean, so many people are receiving these blood transfusions every year. Yeah, and I had no idea how complex it is. But then again, I'm
Yeah.
not an expert in that area. You are, and like so many things, uh, they're just remarkably complex when you focus in and you take a deep dive into it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the so I get the story of where the scientific interest comes from and why you went to school for medicine and to become a medical scientist. When did your interest in like the philosophical foundations or philosophy of science, where did that come from? When did you start thinking like, hey, I'm a scientist, or maybe you had it during your training, but like, you know, I didn't. I know that personally, but like some point you kind of have this realization, like I don't really understand the foundations of science of why it works. I mean, I understand how to kind of turn the machine and get results on the
Hmm.
back end, but so I'm curious as to where that kind of came from for
Well,
you.
yeah, I think most people, whatever they're doing, if they do a task kind of over and over again over a long period of time, they start to see patterns emerge in not just what they're doing, but how they wind up doing it. So I think all scientists probably reflect upon what it is to be thinking scientifically, what it means to make a scientific knowledge claim, what the epistemic properties of science are, but we're not formally taught it. So when I was a assistant professor at Emory, newly hired, I was assigned to teach a course in methodologies of immunology. It's not uncommon for a newly minted professor to be given kind of entry level course to teach, but the curriculum was pretty much up to me. So this is at Emory. And the first year I kind of taught, this is a Western blot, this is flow cytometry, this is an ELISA. These are all techniques we use in to study the immune system. And the students seemed pretty uninterested in that. They could read that, in a protocols book. What they really wanted to know was how to interpret science and how to think about it. And it was very humbling to me because I realized I couldn't teach that to them because no one had ever taught it to me. And so I kind of went on a course of self-education for many years, refined each year, which teaching the class, and ultimately got into it so much that it became an area of scholarly work for me. But I think, a lot of people would say, I'm not interested in this. I want to do the thing. A race car driver doesn't need to understand the principles of an internal combustion engine. But I don't think that a race car driver is ever asked by other people to prove that the car exists, right? So scientists find themselves in a somewhat different circumstance. And the more I've taught this course, the more gratifying it's been. Because one, of course, I learn more from my students than they learn from me, because that's always the case if you're paying attention. But also because I think that students are hungry for this. And it's very strange, right? That we teach students in sciences all about instrumentation. Right? We measure natural phenomena with all manner of instruments. It can be a flow cytometer, a mass spec, a telescope, a microscope, what have you. And we teach them about how that instrument works and how that instrument fails and what kind of errors they might encounter. But all of us have one instrument we have to use, which is the human cognitive apparatus and the logic constructs that we use. And it's very odd to me that we don't teach the particulars of that one instrument all of us have to use to us. And so it's really been a passion of mine because I think it's essential not only for the practice of science, but for the communication of science to non-scientists, which I think we can argue is progressively failing right now and with very dire effects. And we have to find a common dialogue. So all of those things really motivate and excite me for the topic.
Yeah, and I completely agree about what you just said there towards the end about it's really important for scientists to know this because it helps with the communication aspect of how science works. Because yeah, there's definitely a breakdown, and I've had a lot of people on, and this usually comes up with individuals who are scientists and also out there actively engaging with the public, where it's just this. There's definitely a breakdown. Something's going on there, and scientists need to do a better job of it. But anyway, okay, so you didn't actually tackle this learning about the philosophy of science until you were actually a professor and had to teach it. That's
Yeah.
interesting. That is interesting. And I, at the same time, think it's a bit of a tragedy because, as I alluded to earlier, I mean, I think I had to teach myself. I didn't learn it in my scientific training either. I don't understand why it's not taught. It just needs to be,
Agreed.
it should absolutely be taught to all scientists. And I'm not saying that all scientists also need to be philosophers. It's not like you need to go get a separate degree, a philosophy degree. I mean, maybe a minor or something like that, but at least, taking some basic courses in logic, learning about, cognitive biases, things like that, and uh, how it is that science is actually capable of producing new knowledge, and why we can be so confident in that.
Yeah, and at times tragically wrong, right? But
Yes.
what's interesting is that, since the 1920s or 30s, the philosophy of science, the history of science, the study of science, the metacognition has not been carried out by practicing scientists. Now, that may sound a bit rude because it has become a science on its own, right? The science of science. But largely, you and I and other scientists are the subject of study by these other groups. We may be studying nature, they're studying us, and they write about us and they publish about us and they analyze us, and all of that analysis they do of us is largely unknown to us, right? So it's kind of weird. It's almost like a bird walks into a bookstore. This is to kind of paraphrasing Richard Feynman, walks into a bookstore and finds a book on ornithology and starts flipping through it. But the people who wrote the book aren't birds. They've never been birds. And so I think that it's also important to understand that philosophers and historians of science are handicapped, because in most cases, all they have to study is the products of science. Maybe they can go to conferences and embed themselves a little bit in the practice of science, but they basically have our work product. And the way we report science is very different from how we do it. And that's not deceptive. That's necessary, right? Because if you wrote a historical narrative of what you did in the lab and the mistake you made and the thing you broke, and then you were confused by this, but you figured out that, it would be unintelligible and it would waste people's time. So we write science in a very in a logical way that the positivists would have called a rational reconstruction. We put it in a framework that it's going to make sense, but that's not how we do science. And so I think that there also has to be a communication between the birds and the ornithologists. There has to be that kind of help in analyzing things, because the textbooks are right, and they're wrong. Every time I teach my class, I always say, raise a hands. How many of you in high school or college learned that science is a thing that has a method, that you ask a hypothesis, you make a prediction, you go do an experiment to test the prediction, and if the prediction is incorrect, you modify your hypothesis, and so on and so forth. And every hand goes up every time. And that is a very reasonable framework to understand scientific arguments after the fact. But in many cases, not all cases, in many cases, that is not how it's done. And then when students get into the laboratory, they have this moment of crisis. Oh my gosh, my project's horrible. My mentor's confused. This is terrible. This isn't how it's supposed to be. It's not linear and progressive and all that kind of stuff. And you have to sit them down and say, this is okay. You're going to be okay. This is how it normally works. And it's a shock to them, right? So there's also that component of looking it in the eye for what it is. That doesn't really affect the validity of scientific claims, but it does address how science is and then arguably should be practiced.
Yeah, that's interesting what you just said there about how the scientific method as is explained to us when we're younger, like in K through 12, it's most likely not going to work like that for whatever field of science that they end up in. And it just kind of makes me laugh a little bit, because I think as humans, we create these wonderful ideas on paper, and then when you actually go to implement them, it just doesn't work out that way.
Yeah.
It's just like there's this disconnect between theory and experiment. And it's not just science. I mean, there's so many different aspects, like that where it's that way, where you write something out, it looks great on paper, and then in practice, because you have all of these complexities coming into play that you can't actually model out on your when you're doing the theoretical portion of it, and then it's just remarkably complex, and it doesn't work out the way that you think it should. So, but anyway, okay, so I'm really curious. You said that your students really enjoyed this course that you were teaching on the philosophy of science, and
well, I probably have an observation bias, because maybe the ones who hate it don't come and tell me.
Yeah,
But I do get at least some positive feedback. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Thank you for being honest. um, but I'm just curious if your students, like years down the road, if they they gave you feedback or if you stayed in touch at all, if they fully appreciate how important that class is that took, like maybe if it made them a better scientist or made them better in some way to make better decisions throughout their life. I don't know. Have you had any sort of feedback like that, like later on, saying, okay,
So
hey, like looking at me taking this course, comparing myself to other scientists and how they approach things, that it was very beneficial.
yeah, I've had some feedback, and some of it has been very gratifyingly positive that way. But it's funny. Usually, the narrative is more like, "I'm really glad I took your course. I didn't really understand, not really, what you were talking about at the time. But when I carried those concepts with me moving forward, I could see emerging what you were talking about. You know, it's very hard to talk about something this complex in the abstract in a classroom. But yeah, I think it has. I think it has had an effect on people. And the book, I probably the nicest thing that happened to me is I got some correspondence from a high school in South Korea dedicated exclusively to the study of science, where they were using my book in their curriculum, and the students had questions about it. And they started, we had a dialogue back and forth. And so things like that have happened that have really made me feel good about it. But again, this is it's kind of a nuanced topic, and it takes a lot of mental energy to try to untwist what scientists do. And it's probably not possible to step outside of the thing entirely and see it. But I think we really need to at least try, because there's an awful lot of, cool stuff that's very counterintuitive. What shocks me is that I shouldn't say most scientists, that's unfair because I hang out with biologists, but most biologists I talk to would say, yes, you can never prove a hypothesis. I know that, right? You can always gain more and more evidence to support it, but you can never prove it because we can't observe tomorrow, et cetera. But you can disprove a hypothesis, right? So this is a quote from Einstein. It's a misquote, which is that no amount of evidence can ever prove me right, but a single experiment can prove me wrong. But Peridum and Quine demonstrated clearly and elegantly that no hypothesis can ever be disproven. And there's no amount of evidence that can ever reject a hypothesis unless you hold the rest of the universe constant, which we have no ability to do. So it's a web of belief construct, and it's a dance that when something is incoherent, when something doesn't work or doesn't make sense, your hypothesis may be wrong, your observation might be in error, your reasoning between the two may be incorrect, and one of your background assumptions might be wrong. And you can't tell. All you can tell is that something's wrong. You can't tell which part of the equation is wrong. And what's really illuminating is that, in my view, essentially all humans think this way. Whatever your area of study is, even in the sciences, in the pseudosciences, in religion and history and law, humans think this way. But the rules of navigating the web, what you're allowed to change and why to recover coherence, are different. So this idea that science is this fundamentally different thing, yes, it is. And the differences are substantial, but what causes the differences is nuanced and subtle. And I think that it's problematic. One of the things that I really lose patience with, or I get sad about, I should say, is the narrative that, well, people who don't accept science are just irrational or misguided. And if only they understood, logic and critical thinking skills, obviously they'd agree with us, because our logic is so crystal clear and our ideas are so irrefutable that unless you're, kind of an idiot, you'll see what we see as true. And that is as kind of offensive as it is inaccurate. You have to, in my view, you have to understand that there are norms of evidence that vary. There are types of thinking that varies. Now, science, there is data on science. I mean, if you look at the technological progress that science has made, decade after decade, century after century, in technology, if not in understanding, I think we have to admit that if anything is going to work with regards to the natural phenomenon, science is going to work. And other areas that claim to understand natural phenomenon that are often labeled pseudoscience or outside of that tent, are fundamentally problematic in the claims that they make. But it's not because there's anything defective. It doesn't work, but there's nothing dumb about it. It's because these individuals are drinking from a well of human cognitive tendencies that scientists are trained to ignore or even unlearn, right? So a large amount of scientific training is to unlearn millions of years of evolution and to do things that just don't feel right. But I think that defining the landscape of these are the different flavors that humans think in, and these are the effects that they have, and here's where they're useful, is a much healthier narrative.
No, I agree with everything you just said there, and in particular, what I really loved about it is how you framed it as you shouldn't really be name calling these individuals. You shouldn't be looking at them as if they're like stupid people. A lot of these people are very smart, and they've just convinced
Incredibly
themselves.
smart.
Yeah, they're very, very smart, and they put together these brilliant arguments, which take a very long time to sift through and whatnot. And they convince a lot of people that the arguments that they put together are correct. But on careful analysis, they usually break down. I would say, well, I mean, if it falls outside of science, then it's definitely going to break down at some point. And these conversations that need to be had, if we're ever going to change anyone's mind, you can't start off by name calling or thinking the other person is stupid. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. And more conversations need to be had. I mean, part of the issues that we're having with society right now are that people are stuck in their filter bubbles, and they're just not having conversations with people that they don't agree with. And there's name calling and all sorts of nasty diatribes that people throw back and forth at each other. Social media is an absolute mess. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but yeah, social media is just a mess. I've talked ad nauseum on the show about what social media has done to the social fabric of society. But anyway, I digress here, and I am really interested. So I guess we could move on here. So philosophy of science, you wrote you created this course, and then you ended up writing this book, What Science Is and How It Really Works. And at some point, you decided that you want to write another book. So we have Partial Truths. And then I'm just curious as to what was the segue from the first book to the second book. Why did you decide that hey, I need to write this book? Why was it so important to you?
Well, one of the parts of philosophy of science and thinking about science and the practice of science, actually more cognitive psychology of science, is that humans tend to have certain thinking patterns, right, that can be very advantageous, but lead to errors in certain circumstances. And most people have heard of, in the field of heuristics and cognitive psychology and, behavioral economics and whatnot, that there are these thought traps that people fall into. And part of science is learning what those thought traps are and how to avoid them. And it influences the types of evidence that we collect and value above other types of evidence. But in studying that, I saw, or at least I perceived, a pattern emerging that a lot of the errors that are made fit the form of a fraction. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I am not saying that the human mind is a little calculator and there's fractions inside your neurons, and that's how we come up with ideas. That's not what I'm saying. But mathematics is a language for describing the natural world. It's a very special language with very special properties. But a fraction is just a symbolic representation of a common, notion that we would use in English. We'd say a half, right? 1/2. And so there's a pattern that emerges when you think of a fraction simply as a comment on, if you have a population of things, how many of those things have a certain property. Now, I mean, fractions are more complicated than that, but that's a common use of a fraction. And when I looked at the types of cognitive errors that humans tend to make, a lot of them fit that form, because it has to do with filtering the world in a certain way that perverts how you are perceiving all the available information out there. And when I thought about this more deeply, I saw that this manifests itself in all these other areas besides science, to be sure. And so if you're talking about how the human mind works, you're talking about whatever humans think about, which is everything. And so I decided that I wanted to have a crack at investigating the manifestation of these types of cognitive biases in different areas of human interaction, and also to kind of reflect upon more recent progress in understanding why maybe we have these biases and how they are neither all good nor all bad, but what benefits there are to them. And so, the book defines the biases up front and talks about why you can understand them using fractions just as a lens, and then launches into all the different areas of life that this might manifest in. And I thought, given the struggles that you've alluded to, right, that our society is having around the inability of different areas to meaningfully communicate with each other, it's a very ambitious hope. To the extent that anyone reads it, but I hope that that what's in there might be meaningful to people in trying to understand how we think about different things.
Yeah, and I also thought it was really interesting what you said there about how you were, people often think in fractions. That notion had never occurred to me until I read through your book, and I just I kind of, like, a light bulb went off, and I was like, oh yeah, I kind of do that.
Thank you.
Most people kind of do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just never thought about it that way, I suppose. But we do it. I think we almost do it subconsciously,
Yes.
because we just, you learn mathematics very young. It's almost intuitive, like in our society these days, and you just run these run these processes subconsciously. But then, yes, when you break them down and really analyze them, a number of these things that you're doing every day really could be broken down to proportionalities. You're doing statistics, things like that. Just I think you're doing a little bit more with the gut than you are actually pencil and paper. But you're doing statistics in your head. But anyway, talking about you talked about, like, human tendencies, human biases here presented in the book. One of them that I really wanted to talk about is anecdotes, because there was an entire chapter devoted to that right at the beginning about how humans disproportionately rely on anecdotal evidence. And I'm just curious if we could talk about that, like how it gets people in trouble, because we were talking earlier about pseudoscience, and I have a background, and actually this is something that we didn't talk about before we began today's show, is for a while I entertained some pseudoscientific beliefs, such as the vaccines potentially could be dangerous for you, and that genetically modified foods may have some hazards associated with them. And that was because I had a parent who was in the complementary and alternative medical field.
All right.
And so I got heavily influenced by that, and I was like, oh, okay, some of this kind of makes sense. So, when I was talking about earlier, there's very smart people that who have kind of whipped themselves into these belief systems. I like to think of myself as a little bit above average intelligence, and I kind of entertain some of these things for a little bit. And some of the arguments that I was telling myself were definitely well thought out and crafted, but ultimately, kind of, when I learned more about science and dug deeper into the logic and things like that, they ended up falling down, and they didn't hold up, so to speak. But anyway, anecdotes. Let's dig in. Why are they so problematic, and why do humans have a tendency to disproportionately rely on anecdotes and for evidence?
Well, the second question you asked, why do we have this tendency, is an evolutionary question. And most speculation is that we did not evolve, right? So most of our history, we were wandering around as small nomadic groups of hunter-gatherers. We never would have encountered population-based data. We never would have encountered analysis, juxtaposition of groups and statistics and whatnot. We had a small tribe, and people would come and say, oh, over the hill, I saw some bison over there. And we wouldn't say, really? Okay, everybody go to a different hill. How many of you have bison? What's the statistical likelihood you'd see one by chance alone? Are there really bisons over there? Let's calculate a p-value. 0.06. We don't believe they're bisons. We would say, oh, great, bisons. And we go try and hunt them. And if there happen to not be there, we'd say, well, they ran away. And so we're storytelling animals, and we have a kind of a limited access to our own personal experience and what other people, what people we communicate with tell us. But it's very important to note that is evidence. Anecdotal evidence is evidence. And sometimes anecdotal evidence is the vanguard of things that science later comes along and says, wow, yeah, thank goodness someone noticed that, now that we've validated that that's really going on. But anecdotal evidence is problematic because it's just a small part of the broader picture, and it's susceptible to all manner of error. So I want to, because you brought up the vaccine issue, I want to use that as a descriptor, if I may. The people who, I'm going to focus on the measles MMR vaccine and autism, because it's been such a hot topic prior to the pandemic. And, a lot of people have believed, or do believe, that the MMR measles vaccine causes autism. And I'd like to say that this is going to sound a little bit weird, and I'll clarify in a second, that a lot of people who believe it because they have actually observed it. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, if you look at the natural history of autism as a disease or as an illness, it doesn't usually manifest till around 2 years of life. And so someone who has a baby who ultimately develops autism will have normal developmental milestones until around 2 years of age. And then they'll start to manifest symptoms of autism or characteristics of being on the spectrum, or even sometimes regressing. Now, I want to clarify, maybe autism shouldn't be defined as a disease. It's a form of human cognitive development, which has particular characteristics, because some mildly autistic people are geniuses, they're just brilliant. But this is what parents experience, that is normal until 2 years, and then the kids have these manifestations of autism. Now, most MMR vaccines, according to the guidelines of professional pediatric associations, are given around 15 to 18 months of age. Right? So we're in a society that usually mandates vaccines for going to school. Most kids get vaccinated. And what that means is that essentially every parent whose kid develops autistic symptoms had a normal, healthy child, then they got an MMR vaccine, and then they manifested autism. It's confounded in time, right? Basically because these things always happen at the same time. And what that means is that you can guarantee that for every kid who gets autism, they were fine, and then they got the measles vaccine, and then this happened. And to a parent looking at their own child or talking to their friend that has a child, they observed it. Now, we would recognize that as what's called a post hoc ergo propter hoc problem. Just because one thing comes before another doesn't mean it causes it, right? Mm-hmm. It would be very reasonable for me to conclude that gray hair causes heart disease. And if I wanted to help people out there, I'd make sure we all dyed our hair, right? So we didn't get heart disease, because they're confounded in time. And this is anecdotal evidence. And this is where people who would deny, who would say vaccines cause autism, stop. Because this is the type of evidence humans are accustomed to and resonates with us. But that's not the right question, right? The question is not, do kids who get measles vaccines get autism? Clearly, some do. The question is, do kids that get measles vaccines get autism more frequently than kids who don't get a measles vaccine? And that's where a more scientific evaluation comes, because again, on the theme we've been talking about fractions, if the evidence is the stuff on the top of the fraction, the numerator, and you ignore the denominator, if you only pay attention to the kids who get autism and don't talk about the rate or the frequency, you're kind of lost. And numerous studies have come out now juxtaposing kids that get measles vaccine versus those who don't, or those who get the measles vaccine with thimerosal versus those who don't, or societies before and after the measles vaccine, and looking at the rates of autism, and the rates of autism don't go up with the measles vaccine. They just don't. And so a scientist then would say, well, yes, we saw this happen. Yes, we perceived it. Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but the statistical data now trumps that. We were fooled. We saw a trend, and it turned out not to actually be the case. But people who are not receptive to that kind of statistical evidence will stick with the anecdotal evidence and to forever, because there's no convincing them, because it's what type of evidence you value, what carries more weight. And by the way, the scientists are very, open to anecdotal evidence too, and trained professionals generally prefer anecdotal evidence to statistical evidence because it resonates with us naturally. But part of our training is to understand this problem and to focus on statistical evidence.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight, like a number of things that you said there. Like, first off, the beginning of the scientific method or the scientific endeavor is really an interesting observation, and then you explore it further. Yeah. I mean, like, that is like the crux of what science is. So to dismiss anecdotes completely is kind of ridiculous. It is important at the same time, though, for everyone to admit that it is the weakest form of evidence you could possibly come up with, because we have many more powerful forms of evidence these days. But then number two, that people naturally gravitate towards it. I mean, you're talking about, thousands of years of evolution here, and like that was basically all that we had was we're very visual animals, and to observe the environment around us, and we didn't have these scientific methods or these more advanced statistical techniques to kind of crunch the numbers and really dig down and refine our understanding of the world around us. So we relied on anecdotes, and we told these anecdotes through stories. We're great storytellers, as you mentioned, and it's very powerful, and it resonates with us. And I'm of course guilty of this as well. And I think, most people who are listening to this are guilty of weighing the anecdotes more than we probably should. And go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you. One of the points I want to make is that science, if you wanted to characterize science as a approach to things, you could characterize it as it is an approach to mitigate or maybe, if you're really lucky, eliminate errors. And the more we learn about more types of errors, scientific methodology evolves new approaches to handle those errors. So, Joseph Priestley, who is credited with discovering oxygen along with Lavoisier, although Priestley never thought he discovered oxygen, he thought he discovered a way to make dephlogisticated air, but maybe that's a conversation for a different day. If you read his paper from the 1640s, right, he had a couple of mice that he was exposing to this special air he made, and a flame that he exposed to it. But there were only two mice, and there were a couple times he stuck a flame in a jar. And he published this paper, which is arguably one of the most seminal works, right, ever accomplished in chemistry. Now, if you went back in time to talk to Dr. Priestley, and you said to him, well, yeah, this is a really cool anecdotal observation, which it was, right? This is really kind of cool, but how many animals did you test under with and without your special gas? And did you try to figure out if it was a type 1 error and do some kind of, t-test to figure out what the odds are that it was just a mistake, that these happen to be special mice? That would be completely unintelligible to him. He would have no frame of reference for understanding what you were talking about, because statistics theory, probability theory hadn't really emerged even at that point, let alone, being developed. And so I think it's a mistake to say that this defines science, unless you're going to say that the discovery of oxygen was not science. But that the methods of science evolve over time to handle more and more errors as we become aware of them. And and as new technologies are invented, like, big data platforms and omics platforms, we're creating new errors as we go and creating new methods to solve them. But importantly, to your point, none of this is natural. None of this is what we evolved around. None of this is what we're accustomed to. Evolution moves at a glacial pace compared to technology, right? I mean, it takes millennia for our biology to change by natural selection. It takes a couple of years for us to explode the world philosophically with technology. And so really, we're just struggling to keep up. And that's what part of the scientific education is kind of span that gap.
Yeah, and what you said there about looking at what was done with the oxygen studies, and obviously that was science during its time, but looking back on it now, we just kind of like throw our hands up and be like, what were you doing?
Yeah.
But the only reason we know that is because we kept advancing, moving the technology along, which is advancing at an incredibly rapid rate, as you said, compared to human evolution. And it was like newer and better science. So a lot of people will use the argument, well, science has been wrong in the past. Well, I mean, the methodologies were poor and we've refined our understanding, but science wasn't necessarily like completely wrong. And the only reason we know that is because we have newer science that told us that the science. Go ahead.
Can I unpack that a bit? So this is a super important distinction. So first of all, science has been wrong in the past. And by the way, science will be wrong in the future. If you had an instrument that worked much of the time, maybe even most of the time, but sometimes failed, and you could use that versus random guessing, which would you prefer? But this distinction about science being wrong, yes, about its explanations, but not about phenomena. Right. So Priestley thought he had discovered dephlogisticated air. now we can giggle at him and say, "Oh, you silly man, you were wrong. That was oxygen that you were studying." But it still makes flames glow like crazy. So our explanations of why our advances work, or we can predict things, change. If you look at the 1900s, for example, or even before that, look in the 1700s, 1800s, massive technological explosion, right? Unbelievable gain in the ability of humans to predict and control nature. But by our best understanding, all of the theories in those centuries were wrong, all of them. Yet we made these incredible advancements. So science is wrong in its explanations, but science is not that often wrong in what it's learning about natural phenomena. And I think that's an essential distinction that people tend to mix together erroneously. The other story I wanted to tell you, maybe you know this already, is just to show how powerful anecdotal and kind of correlative thinking is that R.A. Fisher, who was one of the pioneers of statistics, right? He came up with, Fisher's t-test, if you've heard of it. He basically came up with a concept of p-values. He came up with the concept of sometimes things happen by chance alone, and we can quantify how often that is. He wrote a number of articles stating very strongly that cancer causes smoking. That was his view.
Cancer causes smoking?
Cancer causes smoking, that people who have cancer tend to smoke. And his view of this was that cancer is an inflammatory disease that probably begins before you become aware of the lump or whatever. It causes inflammation, it makes you uneasy, and it compels people to engage in self-soothing behaviors, so they go out and start smoking. He thought that the association of smoking and cancer was a mistake. It was just a correlation. Do you understand? So when you see that people who have cancer tend to smoke, you can't distinguish, not logically, which caused which. All you can tell is that they go together. And he held firm to this, even when large amounts of statistically important information came out to show the opposite. So I think that as trained as scientists might be, all of us have a version of the human brain in our head. And all of us are susceptible to these types of problems. And one of the very special things about science, which you know all too well, to me, one of the crown jewels of science is the peer review system, where if one scientist goes off into oops land, everyone else is going to correct him or her pretty quickly. And that is very important. You don't see that in other areas. And I'm not trying to pick on alternative or new age beliefs, but if one person says, I think crystals work this way, you don't see people who look at manipulating chakras running tests to disprove that crystal theory. But scientists, we all criticize each other, and that's part of the metric, right? So individual scientists, even the best scientists, have this capacity to just go off into these observational errors. And actually, that's a good thing. There's a large argument in the book. That's a good thing. We need that to some extent, not too much.
Yeah, I definitely do remember reading that portion of your book where you were talking about how humans evolved to not be by themselves. Well, of course, we're gregarious, and we evolved in troops and things like that, or groups. And how we need this debate, how it's like fundamental. I think you were talking about confirmation bias, was it?
Yes.
And then you were talking about how, well, we clearly evolved confirmation bias, so why is this a good thing? And then you were going on to, you expounded about how being with groups that you don't agree with, this I don't know, you could probably explain it better than I could. I don't recall all of the specifics, but that's really I found it fascinating. Perhaps we could talk about that for a little bit.
Well, confirmation bias is this humiliating, embarrassing bias that humans have, that when we believe something, we then filter experience preferentially to support what we already believe. So it's not that seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. I mean, to some extent, not completely. I mean, we're not going to completely change the world to support a belief that is obviously wrong. But we do this, and it attaches to any belief. It's not just beliefs that benefit you. These are not just motivated reasonings. Whatever you believe, you view the world in a way that kind of confirms that belief, and you'll ignore, to some extent, disconfirming evidence. And if there's any bias that has been as reproducible as possible and manifests in multiple areas, this is it. And we could There's so many famous examples, and they're all quite horrible. And they could probably explain in large part what we're experiencing today. So one of the studies I talk about is where they took a group of students, two groups that had different views on the death penalty. Is it a deterrent for murder or not? And they sat them down and they exposed them to some published studies of the effects. And given the same data, the same information, both groups became more strongly convinced of their views, right? So, we have a Supreme Court in this country, 9 incredibly intelligent, incredibly well-educated, rational people, all looking at the same case, all looking at the same briefs, all looking at the same world, coming to widely different conclusions. Unless you're going to have a sinister view that they're just, agenda-driven lackeys, we have to assume that they're processing the world differently, and almost certainly because their background experience is different. But it's an interesting question. Why would we evolve this? That seems weird, right? Why would you evolve something that just makes you hold on to beliefs regardless of what they are? And the argument that's been put forth from multiple sectors, so it comes from the interactionist model of human reasoning, and also from epistemic network modeling, and also studies in the business world around efficiency, is that if we didn't have confirmation bias, we would believe nothing. Now, why do I say this? If there's any philosopher that's known to scientists, it's probably Karl Popper. And Karl Popper famously wrote, right, and said that when you can't prove anything, this is kind of like my quote from Einstein earlier, but you can disprove it. So when you find evidence that disproves a theory, you have to reject the theory because that's logically deducible. But there's always some disconfirming evidence for any theory. You're always going to encounter something in your experience. It may even be a mistake, right? It may even be like a weird just anomaly that goes against what your theory predicts. If we tossed out our theories whenever we encountered any kind of disconfirming evidence, we would just be quivering balls of gray matter. We wouldn't believe anything. And so the argument is that confirmation bias is there so that we stick to our guns long enough that we're not fooled by accidental evidence that might disprove something. And when you're having a group reason debate, you need to stick to your guns long enough to vet out the arguments and the reasoning. And so the two bits of evidence, the experimental evidence that I would call on here, is that there are a number of logical tasks that humans fail, as on average, on their own. But when you let them reason through them together, they succeed fantastically. And there was this wonderful study done by where they took professional scientists and gave them kind of a simulated research experiment, and then instructed them to act in ways that would kind of diminish their confirmation bias. You can't ever really get rid of it. And when they did that, the scientists stopped making forward progress. They just stopped. And the reason is that as soon as a new hypothesis came into their head, they could always think of something that went against it. Right? So they immediately discounted even correct ideas before they had time to vet them out. So confirmation bias is a horrible thing. It probably leads to all kinds of polarization and animus and war. But if you got rid of it, I don't think we'd be able to make any forward progress. We probably couldn't even navigate the world. So like most things we've evolved, it's very helpful in some settings and can be damaging in others.
So if we were to get rid of confirmation bias, we would become so risk adverse that we wouldn't take any sort of risks to push forward, like human knowledge, or
not just risk averse. I think belief devoid, right? So I'm married. I love my wife. We have a great relationship, but sometimes she gets mad at me. Sometimes she gets mad at me and I don't know why. And so when she got mad at me, I immediately rejected the hypothesis that she loved me. I immediately rejected the hypothesis we had a good marriage, and I just walked out of the house, right? Mm-hmm. No matter what belief you have, no matter how strong it is, you are always going to encounter evidence that goes against it. And so we need the ability to maintain our beliefs in the light of disconfirming evidence long enough to figure out, is the belief really false? So Charles Darwin, right? When he published On the Origin of Species, he devoted an entire chapter to the problem of the theory. And after he published it, a number of problems came up that he could not reconcile. He could not figure out in his lifetime. He didn't abandon the theory. He just said, yeah, that's a problem with the theory. We need to work through that or mature the theory. When Galileo, published his work and had a regrettable outcome politically, but scientifically, there were three major objections, major objections in astronomy to why Galileo couldn't be right. And he basically just threw his arms up in the air and says, well, I can't explain those. And frankly, I don't have to. So I think that you'll find that holding on to beliefs despite disconfirming evidence is very important in science, as long as there is an instrument to reject a belief once the evidence is evaluated and comes out, against the idea. So we need our confirmation bias desperately. I can give you endless examples of famous ideas that scientists came up with that at the time there was a lot of disconfirming evidence that ultimately turned out to be true with lowercase t. And thank goodness that they stuck to their guns. That having been said, there's been a lot of horrible, misguided idiocy by scientists, and people have stuck to their guns till their graves because they had their minds were taken over by confirmation bias. But as I mentioned earlier, the peer review system doesn't fall into that, because remember, as a scientist, right, I have confirmation bias towards my theories, yes, but that means I have disconfirmation bias towards other people's theories. And as long as we have an open and trusting dialogue, then those things work in concert so that the whole field doesn't go off the deep end. I often say, and this is not a joke, it's true, is that, my best friends in the world, outside of my immediate family, are people who come to international conferences and try to discredit my ideas in public. That's what they do. And I do it to them. And it's not seen as vicious or mean. Actually, it's necessary. It's compulsory. It's part of what we do. But I think confirmation bias plays that central role in science. It's just that when you find it outside of science without the peer review system, or a system like peer review, then it goes on unballasted, right? Then it just takes over, and that's problematic.
So I think what you're saying is, like most things in life, you've got to find that balance. Not too much, not too little. We need the confirmation bias, but not too much. We can't have too little of it. Otherwise, we're not going to kind of push ourselves to take the leap, to hold on to something for long enough to figure out that it's wrong, or to figure out that it's right.
That's right. So, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And I like what you said there about the science, about how your best friends are the people at the conferences, outside of your immediate family and things like that. Because it's interesting is, within scientific circles, there is a lot of back and forth between people trying to say that you're wrong, or people supporting your positions, and a lot of communication happens, open dialogue. It's not vicious at all. And I think society as a whole would be a lot more better if they learned how to communicate like constructive criticism to one another. Particularly like on social media platforms and things like that, where you have people who are essentially, there's clearly too much confirmation bias, not too little, too much confirmation bias going on. And then you have people who are very strongly holding on to their beliefs, and then you see name calling back and forth, as I had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, scientists are people. There's all kinds of scientists, and there are people with personality disorders everywhere. But in general, the problem, as I see it, is that in a lot of our areas of our public discourse around different ideas, people are trying to win, and winning to them means convincing the other person that they are wrong, and that the person themselves is right. That's not science, not in its best form. In science, winning is getting to a correct answer. And sometimes the correct answer is something that neither side is considering, right? The wave particle duality of light. Is the immune system due to proteins or cells? The answers to these are both, yes, and it's something we don't fully understand. And then the different fields kind of converge onto a new theory. So it's a very different definition of winning. Winning is coming to the correct answer, not defeating the opponent. And I think that's a critical distinction.
Yeah, that's a very, very important distinction. I categorically agree with you on that one. And the whole point of like debate or discourse or dialogue, or however you want to describe it, really is getting to truth. It's not pummeling the opposition to the point where they feel bad about themselves, or they're, calling them names, making them feel stupid. It's really both sides should walk away being better people because you've engaged in this. You've helped
But
each other. Yeah.
This is so fundamentally foreign to the way we have disputation in the rest of our society. We train kids in high school on debate teams. You won, you lost. Right. The debate never ends with both sides compromising to a middle view or someone being convinced. You look at our legal system. Someone goes to jail or they don't. Right. You don't see a defense lawyer suddenly pop up and say, "You're right, my client is guilty," and the client says, "Yeah, you're right. You convinced me. I am guilty." In fact, that would be, a dereliction of duty of the lawyer. So I don't know. Outside of science, we train ourselves. There's a winner and a loser. People hate if there's a tie in a hockey game. People hate it. They hate it. They want an answer. I want someone to win and someone to lose. So it's a very different kind of mindset.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, how many aspects of society where you don't actually have that. So perhaps that's why when people do engage in dialogue outside, outside of the scientific sphere, you see a lot of this winning and losing, where it's just both people are trying to win. And I think what winning means for a lot of individuals is basically making the other person look stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I hate to say it like that, but that's what I've observed quite a bit of. But anyway, okay, so we talked a lot of, we talked about confirmation bias, using anecdotes as evidence. Let's talk about real world examples here about how distorted thinking can lead to bad decision making, because, we all have to make decisions every day, and some decisions are better than others, and we have a variety of different tools at our disposal that we can train ourselves with in order to ensure that we're making, or hopefully making, better decisions. But let's kind of dig into some of these poor decisions from society. For example, you have an entire chapter where you talk about police killings, systemic racism, things like that.
Right. So I want to take a moment and unpack definitions here, because words are clumsy. Language is clumsy, and I think we confabulate a lot where people kind of equivocate and talk past each other.
Sure.
I'm going to define systemic racism right now in our conversation as people being treated differently under the law based upon their race. Or I should even say being treated differently under the law as a function of their race. I am not going to speak to whether or not the system is prejudiced or biased against minorities, or intentionally or not, or whether it was designed in that way. I'm not saying that is or isn't the case. I have my own views on that. I'm a person, but what I'd like to define as, are people treated differently under the law as a result of their race? And I think that most people would agree that if you're treated differently under the law as a result of your race, then that is institutional bias. Okay, or that is racism is such a charged term. But a lot of people would deny this. They would say, no, everyone has the same opportunities, and you do or don't do and whatnot. And obviously there's very strong feelings, again, in favor of affirmative action. There are those who are against affirmative action and all these kinds of things. But let's focus on the policing system. This is what I go to in the book. And there's two examples I'd like to unpack. The first is, our minorities killed by police officers at a higher frequency than non-minorities. And this gets into this fraction example. Now, also let me say, I'd like to acknowledge that the vast majority of police officers are good, honorable people who risk their lives every day for relatively little compensation and protect us all. And we should be grateful for them. And there are those who egregiously violate and abuse the people that they are hired to police. So when we look at this, we have to say, a lot more Caucasians are killed by police every year than minorities, hands down. But that's just the top of the fraction. When you look at the number of minorities killed as a function of the number of minorities there are, it's much higher, right? It's 2-3 times higher. And so this is something we have to look in the eye and acknowledge this happens. And if you're killed more frequently being a minority, whether it's intentional or not, that is a racial disparity across the system. But what I go into most is the big data policing, right? And the reason that I'm very interested in this is because the arguments have been made that, well, yes, humans are biased, yes, humans are racist, whatever. Let's just use computer algorithms. It's a machine. It's ones and zeros in a box. How biased could it be? And the answer is that regrettably, the way it's being used, terribly biased. And let me explain the example I gave. So there is a data. So police departments are using what are called heat maps or heat lists, where if someone gets on a heat list, then they are a person of suspicion, or if an area is on a heat list, and they can actually, these algorithms are fairly good at predicting, when and where crime is likely to happen, what the characteristics of the victims or the assailants may be, what kind of property is more likely to be stolen. But there's a system in California called the CalGang database. And the CalGang database has a number of criteria by which you wind up in the database. And so in the United States of America, in order to be arrested, there has to be probable cause that you've committed a crime or are carrying contraband. But in order for you to be detained and even frisked and searched, there only has to be reasonable suspicion. Now, I'm sure that jury deliberations have consumed most of their time, right, debating what is reasonable. This is a ambiguous term, but it's what a reasonable police officer would find suspicious in behavior. Now, the reason I bring this up is that in California, just being on the CalGang database makes you reasonably suspicious enough to stop and frisk you. Okay, well, what are the criteria for being on the database? Well, there's about 10 of them, but one of them is that you basically are seen associating with gang members. And the other is that you frequent areas that have high gang activity. Well, let's say you happen to live in a neighborhood that has a lot of gang activity. You frequent an area with high gang activity because you live there. And if you're standing on the corner waiting for the light to turn green next to a gang member, you're seen associating with a gang member. And so what that means is that the system has essentially captured anybody who lives in a gang-ridden neighborhood as having a lower Fourth Amendment right than anyone else. And regrettably, for other reasons, we could take a lot of time discussing, gang-ridden neighborhoods tend to be lower socioeconomic status and tends to have a disproportionate number of minorities there. And so even without the intention, what we're saying is in this system is that being of a minority in that system gives you less Fourth Amendment rights than someone who's not a minority. And if that is not being treated differently under the law, I mean, I don't know how you would define it. And so now some people will say, well, yeah, but so what? The cops frisk you. If you're not doing anything wrong, what do you have to worry about? But that's not the point. All right. The point is that people of minority people just have less rights under the law, as we all cling to. And so this is the argument I was making in the book, is that is actually a weird form of confirmation bias, because one of the characteristics of confirmation bias is that you go out and examine things that will confirm your hypothesis more than you examine things that won't, or then you look for things that won't. So in this case, if you look at our incarceration in America, minorities are disproportionately incarcerated, hands down. Well, we are searching them more frequently. We are investigating minorities more frequently. There are strong data out there that in areas where non-minorities have a higher rate of contraband, drugs or other things, minorities are arrested more frequently. And that probably is because police officers have always searched and frisked people of minority status more frequently than not. But here it's built into the computer systems. So this is the manifestations of one of the biases that I'm talking about, because it fits that form.
Yeah, and I think just to build on a few things that you said there, the first being when you're talking about the big data in these systems, a lot of times it's not just with the policing, but we're going to be relying more and more in different aspects of society with the big data as well as the artificial intelligence. And people are like, okay, well, we're going to use this as completely unbiased, but like you create rules when you filter through data. There's
Yeah,
somebody who programs it and tells the artificial intelligence or whatever it is that they're programming, it gives it rules, and you can put bias into those rules. So people have to be very careful when we talk about, oh well, it's going to be great because it's going to be completely unbiased. It's like somebody really has to rigorously analyze the axioms or the foundations for the program as it moves forward, because if nobody does that, there are going to be biases that are baked into it, and then the
absolutely.
whole thing is just biased, and then on the back end of it, it's going to be biased, and people are going to be like, oh well, this is great unbiased data when it's really not, or information when
Totally.
it's really not. Yeah,
Totally. And even if the
yeah,
algorithms are not biased, and that we'd have to talk about what that really meant. If the data you put in comes from biased sources,
yeah,
then the output will also be biased regardless of the algorithm, right? And so um, this is the comical, sad reality is that two of the members on the CalGang database are infants. So, which demonstrates
yeah.
the absurdities that can come out of this if it's if it's applied incorrectly.
Yeah, and then another thing that I wanted to highlight too is that we were talking about the um, with these low income neighborhoods and then the stop and frisk and police interactions. It's well documented that increased interactions between police the and civilians, that's just with increased friction, you're going to have increased conflict. I mean, it's just a numbers game at that point. So if you have areas where police interact with people more, of course you're going to have more violence because you have police interacting with the individuals of society more versus other more, let's say, I don't want to say affluent, but areas where, let's say, people aren't stopping and frisked as often. You're going to have
Right.
decreased interactions with law enforcement.
Now, I think we need to be fair here that it
Yeah,
seems reasonable, right, to deploy. So resources are finite. It seems reasonable to deploy our crime fighting resources in areas where there is more crime. I don't think you can really argue with that. But and we can have a debate as a society whether or not the downsides to that, which is this kind of unfair treatment based upon your race, is worth the benefit, on the crime. In fact, we might actually go so far, and I know it sounds absurd in a democracy, to ask the people who live there what their preferences would be. But what you just said is being amplified even further with these technological advancements. So there's a system called the shot spotter system, which I don't know if you've heard about it, but basically cities put microphones around neighborhoods that listen all the time. And if they hear a sound that sounds like a gunshot, they dispatch the police immediately. And not just that, but they can locate where the shot probably came from. And then the police go there and they just start searching people, and looking for suspects. Well, unfortunately, at this point in time, the hardware is incredibly error prone. One city estimated that upwards of 80% of the times it said that there was a gunshot, there wasn't, and that its ability to locate where the shots are coming from was extremely poor as well. And as you might imagine, these systems have been preferentially installed in high crime neighborhoods, which, for other reasons, tend to be disproportionately inhabited by minorities, right? And so it's just another manifestation of exactly what you were talking about. We have increased investigation, scrutiny, capricious searching of people that based upon their race. And again, I think we should have an open debate as a society about whether the costs and benefits of that is worth it and who we want to be. But we shouldn't deny that it's happening, because these are just what the data are.
yeah, that's very, very alarming. I have not heard of that. And I mean, the percentages, 80% of the time, it's incorrect. I mean, I can't even believe that something like that has been deployed and is
And
being used, because I could just see all sorts of problems with that, because you're sending law enforcement in when they're going in primed with the idea that the suspect has a gun,
right.
and the suspect's probably not even in that area, and I don't even know what the response time is, but you said it's wrong 80% of the time. People move around. They could be in a car shooting. Yeah, that sounds like a
Oh,
disaster.
wrong that there's even been a gunshot fired.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I mean, localization wrong also, but doors being
Yeah.
slammed, all that kind of stuff. And so they're deploying and they're basically searching people. What's very troubling is it has been reported by the Washington Post that the company that makes this technology reported it as being very highly accurate, like in the 90 percentile accurate. And that assessment came from the marketing department of the company, not from any kind of technology development or investigation. So as these advanced technologies become more and more available, there's this greater and greater danger of these types of biases being just baked into the system, as you said, under the auspices of being a remedy, right, to human bias.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Clearly, a lot more work has to be done here because that just doesn't sound like a good idea as of right now. But anyway, I wanted to we've talked about kind of the philosophy of science and all the great things that science has done. We've touched a little bit on the science being an imperfect endeavor. Let's talk more about where science gets it wrong, and the different things that scientists have convinced themselves, like tools that we've convinced ourselves of, or metrics, I should say, and they end up being being falling victim to, I think it's called Goodwin's law, where the metric that you develop actually becomes the goal versus the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm talking about p-hacking, of course, but
So I'm, again, in part because of my background, I'm going to focus much more on the biological sciences, molecular biological sciences than other areas. P-hacking, data dredging, data mining. What we're talking about here for people who are not familiar is that if a scientist thinks that they see an effect, right, and usually this has to do with I'm testing a hypothesis, so I have an intervention and I look at one group versus another group. I'm testing if a drug works. I'm testing if knocking out a gene changes something. But this can be applied to any kind of nature, right? One of the ways to tell if A causes B is you remove A and see if B still happens. So just by chance alone, you're going to see differences when there aren't any actually there, in reality. And by that, I mean, as an example, we may be testing a drug on a disease population, and we randomize the patients into two groups. One gets the drug being tested, one gets a placebo. And you may see that the patients in the drug group do better. But the disease is variable. All diseases are variable. Some people are going to do better and some people are going to do worse just by chance alone. So what are the odds that the difference you're seeing is because people who are going to do better anyway wound up in the drug group, as opposed to the drug actually having an effect? And that's where statistics can quantify that level of uncertainty. Can't get rid of it, but it can tell you. And right now, more or less, the gold standard is what's called a p-value of 0.05. There's a lot of debate about whether that's appropriate. There is debate about whether p-values should be used at all, but this is what the current practice is. And what a p-value of 0.05 means, if correctly calculated, is that there's a 1 in 20 chance that you've made a mistake, but 19 out of 20 times it's a real thing. And sometimes that causes people to scratch their heads. Well, why 1 in 20? Why not 1 in 100? Why don't we make the study so it's a 1 in 100 chance of a mistake, or a 1 in 1,000 chance of a mistake? I'd like there to be fewer mistakes, wouldn't you? And the answer is because resources are finite, and to get that better and better statistical power, you have to have larger and larger studies. And there's also ethics involved, right, in having humans consent to trials, and also other types of experimentation. And this manifests, in pretty much all parts of science when you're doing any kind of comparisons such as these. So where's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that there is what's happening today in the biological arena is what's been called the reproducibility crisis, which I don't like that name because I don't think it's a crisis. I think this problem has been with us forever. But I think we're beginning to recognize that a lot of times things that are given a low p-value, which would indicate that there's a small chance that it's a mistake, that it's real, actually are very likely to be errors. And there's a couple of things that may be causing this. One is that individual scientists may be modifying their experiments unbeknownst to themselves in a way that makes the p-value calculation not meaningful. So if you do a simulated trial where you're allowed to change what are called degrees of freedom, where based upon the results of your experiment, you can make the sample size bigger or smaller, you can kind of keep going with the experiment or stop, you can focus on one sex versus another if you're studying in humans or animals. What you're basically doing is expanding the denominator of the fraction, so your power drops. And so when you do that and you use a test that is not designed to handle that, now the error rate, instead of being 5%, goes up to over 60%. And a lot of the basic studies that are done are really not controlled in that kind of way, because let's face it, there is intuition in science, right? There is, sometimes you have to throw out a data point, you have a very good reason for doing so. Sometimes not a good reason for doing so. And then by the way, I am setting aside individuals who may purposefully manipulate data in order to lie. This does occur, I believe, quite infrequently, but that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about innocent errors around not understanding the methodologies. But something more systemic that people have noted is what is called the publication bias and the file drawer effect. And again, let me define my terms, because publication bias means that there's a bias towards publishing positive data, meaning a new finding versus nothing's there finding. And the file drawer effect refers to the fact that sometimes, knowing about the publication bias, sometimes when people find that there's nothing there with their testing, they never even submit the paper for publication. They toss it in their file drawer. Now, these terms have often been used for drug development in industry, where they are purposefully not publishing negative findings or purposely not submitting negative findings because they don't want to hurt their product. That is an intentional, kind of disingenuous, malicious act. That's not what I'm referring to. So let's say that there are 20 scientists around the world all testing the same hypothesis. And let's say that they all do a p-value determination of 0.05. Well, if there's 20 people doing the same experiment and there's nothing there, right? There's nothing to find. 1 out of 20 will get a positive result with a p-value of less than 0.05. It's actually a little bit more complex than that, but just for the simplicity of math, that's more or less what will happen. If that individual submits their paper for publication because it has a low p-value, and the other 19 scientists never submitted for publication, or if they do submit it, it comes out in an obscure journal that nobody reads, then the view from the field is, wow, this is a really significant finding. When in actuality, you're setting up the system to report chance effects. And then people come along and try to reproduce the finding and it doesn't reproduce, et cetera. So there are systemic problems around publication bias, the file drawer effect, people manipulating experiments without understanding that now they are running the wrong statistical test, and therefore the value isn't meaningful. That kind of is plaguing science at some level. How serious the problem is, we don't know for sure, but it is there. And I think that there are specific measures that could be taken to remedy these problems, and they probably won't be taken for a number of cultural and scientific societal issues. But I think we really need to be mindful of them and pay a lot of attention to them.
Yeah, these, as you said, these are clearly serious issues, and science is not a perfect endeavor, but we've recognized them. People have recognized them, and we need to do something about it. Something absolutely should be done, because the quality of the scientific results are not where they could be. And obviously, there are governmental decisions, there are big decisions in general being made on certain scientific foundations. And if the primary study or studies are not reproducible, or they're flawed in some capacity, but they still got published and they're still trusted, that's a serious problem.
Yeah, even more so because of the systemic nature of publication bias. That extremely talented, honest scientists can carry out studies with perfect methodologies, and we still have this problem because there's a filtering effect on, again, what's on the numerator versus what's on the denominator. You're seeing only the positive findings without the context of the negative findings studying the same thing. And so the frequency of this thing happening is exaggerated. And so there are remedies to this. We could modify publishing practices. We could modify promotion and tenure practices. We could change how funding of science is done to control for this. And I'm hoping that we will. As I mentioned earlier, at least in my view, the history of scientific methodology is that it evolves over time as we become aware of new errors that we previously didn't know. Hopefully, this will be handled, but it has certainly gotten a lot of attention recently, and I think we need to keep remain vigilant about trying to remedy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation, James. And one of the last things that I kind of wanted to wrap today's episode up with is, we talked about a variety of things. You've talked about your first book with the what science is and how it really works, as well as the partial truths, the most recent book, and critical thinking in general. I suppose that's, I think, the first time that we've more or less used that word, but that's kind of what we're talking about. Is like, kind of in a nutshell, what just thinking better, making better decisions, and all these tools at our disposal, and just how prone we are to making poor decisions because our minds are just need to be kind of rewired, retrained, I should say, because we come with this full suite of cognitive biases and other types of logical errors in reasoning. But anyway, what would you say to the average person, who's thinking about buying your books, both the first book and this most recent one, Partial Truths? How can this information positively impact their lives?
Well, I guess,
why should they care? I mean, that's always an important thing. Like, why should somebody
totally.
Why should somebody take the time to kind of learn all of this, read your books, and then, I mean, to go through and actually really learn these skills takes years of concerted effort. I don't know if we're asking the average person to do that, but why is it important for people to care about this?
Well, I'm sure that the publisher would like me to say that this will make you happy, rich, attractive, and all that kind of stuff, but that's not what these books are about. I think from a let me give a modest answer and then a grandiose answer, and then I'll let you be. So the modest answer is that I can't think of anyone I know who wants to hold delusional or untrue beliefs. And I think that by understanding how human minds tend to go wrong, each of us can gain some insight as to how we ourselves are believing things, and appreciate, at the very least, how error-prone humans are, right? So I think it's very humbling, right, to realize how error-prone humans are, and each of us being human. So it causes some circumspection in our beliefs, kind of dials down the intensity of the beliefs a bit, and gives us time to reflect internally and think about it. Perhaps even more importantly, the goal in the first book was to help non-scientists understand what it means when a scientist says they know something. And why would they say something like that? And how is a scientific knowledge claim different than any other knowledge claim? And I can almost guarantee that most lay people do not know what is special about a scientific knowledge claim. And the reason I can guarantee that is I think most scientists don't know what is special about a scientific knowledge claim. I'm not saying that they're not very good at doing science, but when you're sitting around the Thanksgiving table and someone says to you, well, how do you know that? What's the logic behind it? Sometimes you're just stammering of, well, facts and this, blah, blah. So I think that it's helpful at that level. At a very grandiose level, well, I think that it's fair to say that whatever the foibles of human cognition are, they're not serving us well in our society today. I think we can look around and realize that we have lost a common dialogue. We've lost trust and reflective debate. We're a country and maybe a world of polemics and sound bites and anger and distrust, and the goal is to destroy the other side. And if that is your preference, I guess there's nothing to say about that. But I think that we can acknowledge that the reason other people disagree with us is not because they are evil or sinister, but because they see the world differently, but they are rational and logical creatures. Well, if they're rational and logical, and I'm rational and logical, how can they see the world differently than I do? Well, if we're both rational and logical, then it must have to do with how humans perceive based upon their existing beliefs. And my broader hope would be that by reading these books, you can give yourself, and I'm not saying that many people don't already have it, but you can give yourself a common framework for understanding how human minds think enough to have a human cognitive dialogue as opposed to a adversarial hate fest. So anyway, that's the answer to your question. That may be grotesquely optimistic, but a little optimism doesn't hurt.
No, it certainly doesn't hurt. And I love it personally. I mean, that would be like a perfect, if you were to condense that into a couple sentences, a fantastic mission statement for what you're doing.
That was a very polite way of you pointing out that academics are hard at being concise. That was excellent. I can't do it,
No. Well, I mean, I hope that didn't come off as
no, I'm making fun of myself.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I certainly have been known to be verbose, and I like to be. I think it's because we enjoy precision, and when you try to be as precise as possible, not super wordy, but it usually comes out longer than the average person, just because we have a lot to say, because we know a lot. But I mean, I subscribe to that 100%, and I just can't think of anything more important in today's world. I mean, we have so many massive problems facing society. I always touch on this, but global warming is a big societal problem on a global scale.
Yeah.
And just being able to communicate about facts and just talk to one another. I guess it's really, really important century. Go ahead.
I guess to give you the concise answer is that it is my hope that these books would give you the tools to have a good faith attempt to understand other people's points of view, tools you might not currently have.
All right, perfect. We can end it there. Anyway, so James, where can people connect with you? So social media, website, where can they find your books?
Well, thank you. The books can be bought on Amazon.com, or you can go to my website, jameszimring.com, and find information and links to them there.
All right, fantastic. Do you so just send everyone to the website, and then are you active on social media at all?
Not really. Not as much as people say I should be. Time is finite. So yeah, no.
It's all right. You're saving yourself some mental health there by not being super active on social media. But anyway, okay, wonderful. For those of you that have joined us for today's episode, thank you so much for stopping by. We certainly appreciate the support, and I hope you thoroughly enjoyed it. If you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure to share it, and stay tuned for more great content moving forward. Take care.